In early February, a single American-made Abrams tank was reportedly lost near a small village. Most people outside a handful of OSINT trackers had never heard of. No major outlet covered it. No dramatic footage circulated. By any normal measure, it looked like a minor, forgettable setback in a war full of them. It was not a setback. It was the opening move of an operation Ukraine had decided, deliberately, to keep almost entirely invisible for the next 8 months. On August 12, that silence ended. Ukraine's president announced that an operation running from late January to mid-August had liberated 745 square kilometers of territory and 26 villages across 3 regions, inflicting what Ukrainian officials describe as roughly 9,500 Russian soldiers killed in the process. Independent analysts confirm the scale is real, even if the exact number is still being verified. This is the largest territory Ukraine has reclaimed in a single operation since the counteroffensives that liberated Kharkiv and Kherson back in 2022. And almost nobody outside the units involved knew it was happening until it was already finished. Let's find out with Decision Military. Before going further into how an operation this large stayed hidden for 8 months, it is worth subscribing to Decision Military and sharing this video, because understanding how silence itself can function as a weapon says as much about modern war as any single battle does. To understand why this location mattered, it helps to understand what Russia was trying to build there. The Oleksandrivka direction sits at the point where Dnipropetrovsk, Zaporizhzhia, and Donetsk oblasts meet, a seam in the front line that Russian forces had been pushing into since the middle of 2025. Moscow's spring and summer 2026 offensive treated this seam as an opportunity, attempting to carve out a forward salient into Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, a region Russian forces had not previously held ground inside in significant numbers. If that salient had been allowed to solidify, it would have given Russia both a symbolic foothold in a new region and a launching point for further pressure deeper into Ukrainian-held territory. This is the system Ukraine's operation was built to dismantle, and the first pressure point began quietly, in the coldest part of the year. Between late January and February, Ukrainian units, reportedly including elements of the 78th, 79th, 80th, 82nd, and 95th Air Assault Brigades, along with the 1st and 425th Assault Regiments, began clearing contested villages along a roughly 45-kilometer stretch of front between Dnipropetrovsk and a settlement called Zeleny High. The Abrams tank lost in early February belonged to this opening phase. By March, according to reporting from the ground, other Abrams crews from the same assault forces were reportedly engaging Russian troops at point-blank range with their own 120mm main guns, a level of close, direct armored engagement that rarely appears in footage precisely because commanders chose not to release it. This was not an accident of bad communications. It was a deliberate operational security decision, made and sustained for months. Next, the second pressure point extended that same quiet approach through the spring. Ukrainian forces reportedly pushed toward a settlement called Komar, roughly 12 kilometers southeast of Zeleny High, in what one analyst tracking the operation described as a slow, quiet advance conducted with very few videos and small, tightly controlled teams. Most independent trackers who normally document Ukrainian advances in near real time respected the operational blackout rather than publishing partial or speculative maps. That restraint mattered. A frontline advance that never appears on public maps cannot easily be targeted by an adversary trying to reinforce the exact sector under the most pressure. And it cannot be used by that adversary's own information operations to claim the area was never seriously contested in the first place. The operational logic behind that silence follows a simple chain. If Russian commanders cannot see where Ukrainian forces are concentrating, they cannot decide where to reinforce with any confidence, which means every unit they hold in reserve is effectively guessing at the most threatened sector rather than responding to confirmed intelligence. If Russian planners cannot confirm losses in real time, they cannot accurately report the true state of the front to their own chain of command, which delays any coordinated response by whatever time it takes for the picture to become undeniable. And if the wider public, including foreign analysts, cannot verify claims either way. Disinformation attempting to minimize or deny Ukrainian gains has nothing solid to attach itself to until Kyiv chooses to release its own account. Each link in that chain bought the operation more time to expand before Russia's response could catch up to reality on the ground. That leads to the third pressure point, which is where the operation stopped being quiet and became the headline it is now. Through the summer months, the same units expanded their gains across the full width of the Oleksandrivka direction, eventually liberating 26 villages spanning Dnipropetrovsk, Donetsk, and Zaporizhzhia oblasts by the time results were announced on August 12. Kyiv's own accounting places the total liberated territory at 745 square kilometers. The Institute for the Study of War, using a more conservative geolocation-based method, independently verified a somewhat smaller figure of roughly 627 square kilometers across the same sector. That gap between the two numbers is not a contradiction. It is itself evidence of how tightly this operation was controlled, since even analysts who track Ukrainian advances for a living could not fully confirm the true scale until Ukraine chose to reveal it. Here is where these three pressure points compound into something larger than a sequence of village names. Each phase fed directly into the next, denying Russian planners the one thing an offensive needs most: a stable, uncontested rear area to build from. A Russian force trying to consolidate a salient cannot do so while the flank it assumed was quiet is actually being methodically dismantled underneath it. By the time the operation became visible in August, Russian units had reportedly been pushed back over the administrative border of Dnipropetrovsk Oblast entirely, stripping Moscow of nearly all the ground it had gained in that region since it first entered it in June of 2025. The cumulative effect reframes the entire narrative around this stretch of the war. Ukrainian officials report Russian losses in the operation at roughly 9,550 killed and more than 6,600 wounded, alongside an unspecified number of prisoners added to Ukraine's exchange reserves. Analysts at the Institute for the Study of War have framed the results as evidence that Ukrainian forces remain capable of mounting coordinated, mechanized counterattacks after more than 4 years of a war that outside observers had increasingly described as a grinding, largely static stalemate. A single operation does not undo 4 years of attritional fighting elsewhere on the map, but it does force a real question about every other sector currently described, from the outside, as quiet. If Ukraine was capable of hiding an 8-month, 745 square kilometer operation in plain sight, the next reasonable question is what else is currently being kept off the map on purpose. Silence, it turns out, is not the same thing as inactivity. Analysts and observers reading the front line now have to weigh every quiet sector against the possibility that quiet is itself a chosen operational posture, not evidence that nothing is happening. That shift in how the war should be read from the outside may end up mattering as much as the ground that was actually retaken. One tank, lost in February, in a village nobody outside a small circle of analysts had heard of. 26 villages, liberated by August, across 3 regions, 745 square kilometers by Kyiv's count, 627 by the most conservative independent estimate. 9,550 Russian soldiers killed, by Ukraine's own accounting. 8 months of near-total silence, broken in a single social media post. Each detail is small enough to miss on its own. Together, they describe the largest piece of ground Ukraine has taken back in a single operation since 2022. This channel studies operations like this one to understand how wars are actually decided, not to turn a liberated village into a highlight reel. Behind every square kilometer on that map is a unit that fought for 8 months without recognition, and families on both sides of the front line who spent that same silence not knowing what was happening to the people they loved. So, if an operation this large could stay almost completely hidden for 8 months, what does that mean for how confidently anyone, including this channel, can describe any sector of this war as quiet? Consider subscribing to Decision Military for the next analysis, because the parts of a war that go unseen often matter as much as the parts that make the news.